A very good evening and welcome to yet another face-to-face edition coming to live and direct from our Newsfirst studios here in Colombo. And tonight with me we have Mr. Kusum Vijay-Tilaka, Associate Member of the SJB Working Committee. A very good evening to you, Kusum, and thank you for joining me on the show.
Happy New Year to you and Happy New Year to your audience, and thanks for having me.
A very Happy New Year to you too, Kusum, although the general sentiment might not be that it is a Happy New Year. That will more or less be an obligatory statement to say that it's a Happy New Year. What do you think?
Well, I think I viewed some of the programs on your channel as well as other channels, and I think I saw a fair bit of concentration and focus on the New Year extravaganzas around Colombo, the Golf Face Green, the lights and
the swathes of people who were there.
So I think what it suggests, Jaimal, is it's something that we've seen around the world in terms of countries that have been in recessions, is that there is a divergence in the economy, right? Where there's a very small group of people that do slightly better than they did the previous years. And there's a mass of people at the bottom that are basically trampled and left with nothing. So we're seeing signs of that here as well in Sri Lanka. I mean, if you take a look at any of the business times, the daily business times, you'll see private companies, the larger conglomerates, the financial sector, they're always releasing new profits, better revenues, etc. Of course, there's a few
stopgaps here and there.
That happens. But generally speaking, this divergence is the problem. Where I think there was a United Nations Development Program report out recently that showed the inequality in Sri Lanka. I think it was something like the top 1% of income earners in Sri Lanka own something like 30% of all
Sri Lanka was among the countries with the highest disparity.
Yes, so in the top 5 in the Asia Pacific, we're one of the most unequal countries in the world. And just for the sake, if it's the top 1% owns 30%, but the bottom 50% own less than 4% of the wealth in Sri Lanka. So this shows you this is not a sustainable economy. These kinds of disparities or inequalities, they're not sustainable. And in the longer term, in the medium term, there will be certain cracks that the government will deal with if we don't address these issues going forward.
So one thing that burdened the people the most late last year and early this year was firstly the tax hikes when it comes to income tax, and from the 1st of January the increase of the value-added tax from 15 to 18%. And this has had an effect in multiple industries to multiple goods and services, and the people are finding it difficult as it is, and this new tax burden has brought them even more distress. Does the government have no alternative to increase their revenue purely beyond increasing taxes? Why don't they go to the top corporates or even try to recover outstanding taxes that have been evaded since time immemorial, Kusum? What is happening here?
I mean, this government has been in power for about 15-16 months now, and we've seen reforms. When they talk about reforms, what they mean is passing the burden on to the end user, the consumer, the people.
Yes, exactly.
That's generally what they mean by burden sharing. I think recently the news, we saw the president give a speech from the Akurigoda army camp. I'm sure viewers would have noticed the pomp and pageantry. There were helicopters flying in with flags. There were massive amounts of vehicles, jeeps, motorcycles. This didn't seem like a country where you're undergoing major economic distress. They panned out, even your channel, we panned out to the aerial footage of the Akurigoda military complex. I mean, is there a more emblematic symbol of largesse from the government, right? And at the same time, when the president talks about, the people bearing challenges, the IMF and international institutions have said for a while that we need a revenue-based fiscal consolidation. Now, what have we done with this revenue-based fiscal consolidation? We've basically started taxing the people as much as we can. Now, what one would have expected, something that's all the data, this is not me saying it, all the data shows that Sri Lanka is one of the countries with the lowest tax bases. We have the least number of people paying tax. We have something like 1.2 to 1.4 million motor cars, but only a few 100,000 tax files. So this is part of this TIN business that's coming up. But one of the main issues Sri Lanka has is that we have a very regressive tax structure.
Regime,
some 80% of all our taxes are from indirect taxes, and this is probably going to make it worse because we're just using more indirect taxes to raise revenue. What we should have done, what this budget should have done, is invested made historic investments in the Indian Revenue Service so that they can start going after people that evade taxes. It's not as difficult as at people make it sound, but it does require some funds and it requires some focus.
Yes.
And now you mentioned money that's been stolen, and let's take a look at the sugar scam. There was about 10 billion lost there. That's a crime, but no criminals, right? So then there's taxes that have been collected from casinos.
Yes.
There are taxes that have been collected from alcohol manufacturers. And these are big amounts. These are not small pies, 10, 20 million. These are hundreds of millions, numbering in the billions. So at what point do we start seeing some equity in this process? You know, we're not saying don't tax the people, because obviously now we've agreed to an IMF program and we have to raise our revenue.
Yes, true.
But we're saying let's make the structure fairer. Why not? Because it makes us feel nice, but it's better for the economy as a whole. Because what's happening is, as you get more and more well concentrated at the top, the whole economy struggles, because what do people do if you have if you give a corporate a tax cut? Generally what's happened throughout the world, not just in Sri Lanka, again this is not me saying it, all that happens is you get higher dividends, you get share buybacks, you get very little in the terms of capital expenditure, very little investment into the training of employees and so on. You know, the bonuses don't go up except for the CEOs and the very high
C-suite management. Yes,
exactly. So in this kind of a context, in this kind of an economy, the people have the right to expect more. And you talk about alternatives. There have always been alternatives, but it's very difficult to sort of look out for alternatives when it's the same people in power. And that's something that I think most of the people that on your show, I watch these shows regularly, and it's quite sad that most of the time we end up having the same conversations, right? Because at the end of the day, it's the same people at the top, and we're expecting different results. And
we discuss more often about what ought to be rather than what actually is. Anyone can sit here and tell me this, that and the other, but the fact of the matter is Sri Lankans are suffering here and at present. But let's talk about the SJB's economic policies. We know that there is a separate economic team that is governing the economic policy, the blueprint, and that has also come into certain amendments over the past few months, taking into account the economic climate. So had the SJB gotten the chance to regulate taxes, to increase government revenue and so on, will that be a consideration for the SJB's blueprint? How will you have taken measures to increase government revenue, Kusum?
Well, one of the main things that we would do is look at the highest levels of marginal income tax. Right. So right now in this system, I'm not sure about the exact figures, but if you take someone who earns, let's say, $1 million rupees and someone who earns 4 million rupees, they're paying roughly the same amount of tax. The highest tax rates in the country for personal income tax is about 35%.
Yes.
Right. In other countries that are not going through recession, that don't have historically low revenue generation, they're still going at about 45% for the highest income brackets, right? And then we have to look at our corporate tax to revenue, corporate tax revenue to GDP. We have one of the lowest in our region, especially amongst the Asian developing countries. So corporate taxes, I think it's one thing people will ask, well, corporate taxes are quite high, you know, that's about 30 to 35%. That's the tax rate on paper. The effective tax rates are often much less. On top of this, we're saying fiscal consolidation, we have to tax everyone, people have to do their part. But on the other side, we saw the Minister Amunugama giving details about more tax breaks to a large conglomerate related to the port city through the Strategic Development Projects Act. Dr. Shamini Kure of the IMF, she was very clear that these tax holidays, just I think a few months ago she gave a speech. She's a former director of the IMF, so not some kind of a communist lefty, you know,
who is just always
someone who's a
critical.
respected economist, basically said that incentives, tax breaks to corporations are basically handouts, cash handouts to private shareholders. That's all it is. Now, if you want to incentivize investments, pick certain sectors, strategize it. It shouldn't be a case of one or two ministers getting together and putting a cabinet paper and saying, yeah, this is good for investments. There should be a sort of cost-benefit analysis, and that should be transparent, because right now, if you're going to give, and we're talking hundreds of billions of rupees in tax breaks over 25 years, right? So if you're going to give such huge tax breaks to a company, I think in this context, in this climate, you have to be a lot more transparent about these things, right? So things like the Strategic Development Projects Act, Dr. Shamini Kure mentioned specifically that this should have been removed on day one. It could have been removed on day one. So this is the same kind of conversation that we had during Yahapalne, you know, when Prime Minister Wickremesinghe was there. We were talking about reducing corruption, independent commissions, independent constitutional councils. All of that came to zero. I mean, what we essentially had was independent bodies that were under the Prime Minister at the time, an executive Prime Minister. Right now we have an executive President. What happened to Mr. Wickremesinghe China's long-standing belief in reducing the power of the executive.
And devolving power further.
All of that is forgotten,
Yes.
right? So we are in a situation where there is state capture by the very people that crashed the economy.
Right.
They have taken every measure they can to suppress any kind of dissent. And I think they're using all sorts of the media, for instance, is also being used in a certain way. I saw a newspaper recently, you saw the SJB attracted 2 or 3 members of parliament from other parties.
Yes, the SLFP and yes.
And this was reported. Whether you or anybody else agrees or disagrees with these crossovers or alliances, the fact of the matter is that it's happening, and it's a fairly big deal. The way that the media is reporting it, I looked at one of the major English newspapers. They had 3 boxes on the front page. And one of them said something about the UNP launching, looking for grand alliances. There was one saying the SLPP will be forming some kind of coalition.
Right.
Those were just expectations. But the one in the middle, the SJB, actually had people crossing over into the alliance. But that was not really something that was focused on. So I think the SJB has some work to do in terms of winning the marketing battle.
Right.
I think it's clear that the NPP, JVP are making strides with very large meetings, and they've certainly got the youth base behind them. Whether that will translate into votes is a different matter. And I think as this new year kicks in, the SJB will be releasing another version, the Blueprint 3.0, along with trade and industry policy.
I see.
And this is really where the rubber meets the road, Jaimal, because the fact of the matter is that we can talk about a fiscal consolidation, fiscal deficit, all we like. But if we don't improve our trade balance, and if we don't industrialize our economy and grow our exports and diversify our export base, we're going to be back here in about 5 years' time. So literally in about 3 to 4 years, we expect to gain access back to the ISB market.
Right.
So then we'll be back to borrowing ISBs.
Yes.
And then we'll be happy because we would have gotten the tranches from the IMF, and we would have said, okay, now our debt is sustainable, and we'll be happy for a while. And then whatever government is there at the time will
get
once
back
again
into that
go
same
into
vicious cycle.
You can see right now, I mean, what has really changed in the last 1 year? I mean, there's absolutely zero accountability for anything that's happened. We mentioned the various the sugar scams.
The scams, the corruption, the fraud.
The current acting IGP has been mentioned by the Supreme Court, and he's still working, and he's now he's going on this drug.
So I want to touch on that. I want to touch on Yuktiya and the war on drugs and the underworld as well. There are several high-profile cases that are still unresolved. For example, let's take the Easter Sunday attacks that are still unresolved. The masterminds have not been brought to book. Every now and then we get a statement from a responsible official. He says that it's 99% complete, it's 90% complete. We don't know what is happening. But now, towards the turn of the year, Yuktiya, this operation against the underworld and drugs, commenced, and it's still continuing. And one might believe that it just might be, for all of its positive outcomes, it just might be a political tactic, because we know that a presidential election is up and coming. What is the SJB's take on that, and what is your personal view on it?
Well, Jaimal, the SJB leader, Sajid Premadas, has spoken very strongly about ending the drug menace in Sri Lanka, and we support measures that take into consideration this drug menace, no question about that. I think, although I want to point out to your audience that if you take a look at political parties around Europe, especially even the more advanced democratic nations in Europe, for instance, these political parties, the Republican Party in America, the UK Conservatives, these parties have basically lost their mandates. They no longer have a majority within their electorates. And why is that big? It's because their economic programs and their political programs are just not attractive, right? Their political programs are based on securing wealth and ensuring that the topmost the management class and the ownership class are taken care of. In such a situation, you have to then appeal to what's called social issues, or what they call values, right? So you'll see this across Europe right now. I mean, if you take Germany, if you take Italy, France, you see these countries now, they're focused very much on immigration. The UK Conservatives are extremely well focused on immigration, when the UK has so many other issues related to Brexit, etc.
They're curbing immigration and so on.
That's the main thing that they're focusing on in the United States right now. It's abortion and immigration, the southern border.
It's a case of maybe giving the people what they want.
It's sort of taking away the emphasis from
is it like wailing the real problems with those kind of populist
if you want to, for example, in Sri Lanka, if you want to solve the drug problem, I think this government and all this government talks about market forces, right? So there's two sides to the drug problem. There's a supply side.
Yes.
There's also a demand side. So what are we doing about the demand side? Then how many of the kingpins of the underworld have we actually caught? We know some of them are abroad in Dubai and other countries. I mean, there has been members of parliament, ministers implicated in the drug trade. You know, have they been questioned? What we do see is a lot of teenagers and young adults picked up for possession of minor amounts of small amounts of drugs for narcotics, for cannabis. But are we getting large amounts of heroin off the road? I don't see that happening. And you know, what generally happens is drugs are an addiction, and just because you cut the supply off, what you're doing is making people more desperate, because I don't see that we have any large-scale system of rehabilitation. Our prisons are overcrowded. So what is this system really going to achieve? I mean, it's quite simply a way to take focus away from the politics of the issue. And I'm sure in these coming few months, Jaimal, will see the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna talking about the national question, Buddhism, nationalism. I mean, they will bring out all these other issues to sort of distract from the economic issue. But something tells me, and a lot of people I think agree, that this time is going to be difficult to take the focus away from the economy.
Because the people have been going through the same old stories for many years, right?
Yes, I mean, there's people want solutions, right? And it's very easy for someone to say, yeah, well, at least they're doing something about the drug problem. At least there's safeguarding the position of Buddhism in the country. That's not going to work anymore. I don't think it's going to work.
So let's talk about a solution that the people want. The SJB consists of many representatives in parliament who were part of the Yahapalne government. And when the Aragalaya happened last year, the people didn't say SLPP out, they said 225 out. So what makes you think that you have now the confidence of the people to regain the popular vote and also to establish a government that is led by a president of the Samagi Jana Balavega or the Samagi Jana Alliance?
I'm not 100% sure that I think the 225, all 225 out is there in some strand of society. I don't think that's the case. For me, in my analysis, the key divide during the Aragalaya is the Rajapaksa establishment versus the people. Now, when you take the Rajapaksa establishment and you look at the political context and the political parties in Sri Lanka right now, which of these political parties and which of the politicians can you safely say 100% have never been part of a Rajapaksa administration, have never worked with the Rajapaksas, and have no dealings with the Rajapaksas?
Yes.
That would be Sajid Premadasa and the SJB, and there may be a few members of the SJB that have worked with the Rajapaksas, but by and large, the economic policy team, the lead of the party, the mainstays in the party, have never been Rajapaksa acolytes. They've never been
associated.
And I think it's very obvious that the Rajapaksas aren't fans of them. Right? Let's be very clear that Mahinda Rajapaksas never approached Sajid Premadasa to form a coalition. Right? Ranil Wickremesinghe has never approached Sajid Premadasa back then to form a coalition. Right? It was, if you remember how Sajid Premadasa became the presidential candidate, how long it took for him to be announced. And in the days before the presidential election in 2019, Ranil Wickremesinghe said, no matter who wins the presidency, I will still be Prime Minister, knowing how unpopular he was as Prime Minister. These were the reasons that the SJB split from the UNP. And I think as long as the SJB can maintain a good distance from those elements in our political context that are undesirable to the people, and I think the people are clear. They can see who was on their side and they know who was not on their side. For example, the SJB brought the no confidence motion against Kehlia Rambukwel, the former health minister. And the opposition leader, Mr. Premadasa, was very clear, right? He said, remember the names of the people who voted in favor of him during the no confidence motion. And then you can see who is for the people and who is not. Now, the health ministry, the immunoglobulin issue, and the Isoles company, that is a 100% fraud. It's been proven. The secretary to the ministry and the officials said, well, the minister told me to do it. The CID goes to the minister's house. So Jaimal, I'm asking you and I ask the audience, what has really changed? I mean, the reason our country is in this position is because for over a decade, the Rajapaksa establishment and even the Yahapalne to a degree, they started putting people into high places that were not independent, that they knew were yes men, that they knew would just toe the line. So this goes from Ajit Niwad Cabral to Dr. P.P. Jayasundara, right? So,
and there was large-scale political impunity, even if they did make a blunder and it was exposed.
Precisely, and that's happening by right now. I mean, so the whole of last year, the IMF governance diagnostic report mentions the same thing. Talks about corruption vulnerabilities, talks about unsolicited projects, talks about the fact that some of these projects, the road projects, infrastructure projects, are 3 times the cost, the average cost globally, right? So it's all there in black and white. And this government has not made, I don't see any good faith attempts. I think there's been some legislation, there's been some rhetoric, but by and large, what has the government done? Its legislative record is related to censoring people, the online safety bill, the high security zones bill, so the Prevention of Terrorism Act. So you can see where the government's focus is, and you can see where the people's problems are. These two things are not aligned, and I think there's a very small strata within Colombo that sees stability as the be-all, end-all. But I think a lot of these people will have a rude awakening in another couple of years' time when we are back to this situation where we are looking for stability because we've not really addressed the disease. We've only managed the symptoms a little bit and said, now things are better. So yeah, I just don't see this current trajectory leading to any positive outcomes for the people. I really think it needs a branch, and I think the fact.
So what sort of a panacea does Sri Lanka really require?
I think that the point is that we have to, and this was in the UNDP report as well, is that even when the IMF process started, when the IMF team came here, they talked about cash transfers, they talked about protecting the poor, social protections, right? That should have been central to the economic policy. And in fact, the opposition leader, the members of the economic team, Dr. Harshidi Silva and Mr. Premadasa Eran Wickramatunge, they said very clearly when we released the details of the IMF program, we said the fiscal consolidation is very sharp. It's a very short space of time to achieve this fiscal consolidation. We also said that the revenue targets would be very difficult to meet, and so far all of that has been proven right.
If I'm not mistaken, the opposition leader even met Peter Brewer when they were in Sri Lanka.
Yes, and these things were discussed. It's just the fact is that we can't blame the IMF. We gave this plan to the IMF. The government, the Wickramatunge government, along with the Pohot tour, they decided this. They said this is the only way to do it. Now, the SJB is in a difficult position because at the end of the day, we know that we can't make false promises. That's not the kind of party that this is, right? The SJB's rhetoric has been very moderate, maybe moderate to a fault, and even I've criticized some of it. I've said maybe the rhetoric needs to be a little more hopeful, maybe the rhetoric can be a little more populist. But at the same time, I think it's important to reflect to the people that the SJB and the members of the SJB will be what I like to call a responsible custodian of the economy, not just a populist government. But at the same time, we have to understand that Eran Wickramatunge, Dr. Harshidi Silva, Kabir Hashim, and Sajid Premadasa have all mentioned that the SJB's economic policy is not just a liberal policy. This is actually Mr. Honorable Eran Wickramatunge, what he said. It's not just a liberal economic policy. It's a social democratic party with social market principles. Right now, I'm more to the social democratic side, but the social market economy is a fairly good middle path based on the 4 or 5 personalities that are drafting the economic plan. So while of course there are places where you and I might agree and disagree with the SJB's economic policy, it certainly seems that it's an alternative. And when you look at the blueprint, when you look at the ideas that we have to connect with global supply chains, we have a very razor-sharp focus, a laser-like focus on the trade deficit, and that's going to be something that a future SJB government pays very close attention to, because if we don't industrialize, if we don't get our exports up, we will, like I said, we will be back here once again in a couple of years' time.
So talking about industrialization, getting our exports up and so on, in order for us to do so, I think we need to reach out to the world. We need to get in investment from private entities and foreign direct investment and so on. But I feel like over the years, Sri Lanka has somewhat had to make a larger compromise than other countries when they do attract investments, particularly from large international corporations, by way of maybe ceding certain authority of some of its assets and so on. So how does the SJB go about making sure that Sri Lanka's interests are also protected when it comes to the international game of things? Because although we are not a key player in the world, we know that we are a strategically important player in the world, given our strategic location, our geographical location. So how will the SJB manage foreign relations? How will the SJB make sure that Sri Lanka's interests are also protected, but we also enjoy the benefits of inviting investments?
It's difficult, Jaimal, right? Because right now, when it comes to investments, Sri Lanka will be a price taker. Everyone knows that we are struggling. Everyone knows that we need investments. And the sophisticated investor is not going to come here for fun. He's going to come here with very clear return on investment in mind. He's going to come here with very clear outcomes in mind. I just want to ask the viewers what they think, because the fact of the matter is that when you look at investments in Sri Lanka, what do you have? You have China Merchant Engineering Company, and now you have Adani. Okay, so are these the only investors in the world? Because every project that comes out, there seems to be some connection to these two, who are either a state entity, a state-connected entity from China, or the Adani Group
in India,
something similar. So, what is stopping some of the larger companies, the Samsungs, the Motorola's, all these companies, Apple? What is stopping them from coming here? It seems to me that our investment climate is just not conducive to that kind of thing. I mean, when you come here, you know how difficult it is, even if you're a Sri Lankan, to open to get a company
especially
running,
to get BOI
approval. And really, I think, for example, what we talked about before, the Strategic Development Projects Act, that's sort of a little glimpse into this system, right? It's like, if you know the minister, if you know the right people, you can get almost anything done. You can get any tax break you want, you can get any land you want transferred to your name, you can get land in the port city, electric connection, water, you can get all that. If you're a genuine investor that's coming in, without these government-to-government links, then you're going to struggle, because I know from my previous career in the banking industry, I know how difficult it is for a foreign investor at the time, especially to even open an SIA account, the investment account, to get his funds in with the guarantee that he'll be able to take it out again, because Sri Lanka has very strict exchange controls. So these are things that we have to, there's a ease of doing business index, right? Sri Lanka has consistently been extremely low. Out of 190 countries, we are somewhere just above the middle, so in the hundreds range. So the SJB has a plan for all of these things. But more than anything, Jaimal, it's about governance. It's about giving an investor the idea that if you come here and you sign a document, and if you go to courts,
you will be protected.
That we will be protected. Investor rights in Sri Lanka are also dependent on who you know, how much you can spend within the
connections
system,
you have,
the connections you have. So that's not how you can go about it. You have to show people that it's a level playing field. That if there is, for example, in Sri Lanka, to execute a breach of contract, it takes twice the number of days it takes in a different economy, say Malaysia or Singapore, for instance. So just those basic things. If you can't go to courts and get your contract executed, then what's the point in doing business, right? Then you're lost here. Because you and I, if we go to how much, even if you had $1 million, would you invest it? If you're a foreign investor, would you invest it in Sri Lanka or any of these other countries? Because we are not just in isolation in this region. We are in a region that is with some of the fastest growing economies in the world. Right? So we have to now start looking at those economies, and it's not rocket science, right? Because all these countries have certain frameworks in place. So we have to look at those frameworks, find the weaknesses, see what our strengths are, and see how we can match those up.
Because we are already fallen behind.
We are so far behind, and we've missed many opportunities. I think just look at Vietnam, for instance. Vietnam has its own issues, but by and large, its manufacturing sector is so dynamic that it went from just making textiles to electronic items to personal computers. And when the COVID-19 pandemic came up, they very quickly changed to cameras, webcams, microphones. So that's the kind of dynamism.
To address supply needs.
So it's just about having a dynamic industry, and that has to be incentivized to a degree by the government. So what we keep doing in Sri Lanka is that we get a few international players to come in, set up like an assembly plant, for instance. Now, assembly plants are good, but assembly plants are not manufacturing components. They're not real value addition. They're not, then you can just fold up your assembly plant here and go somewhere else. It's not very difficult. But once you start having a manufacturing capacity and a factory, then you have these components, you have these primary products that need to get, then you then it starts building up employment in
an ecosystem as well.
An ecosystem develops. It doesn't even have to be the government that does it. The private sector comes in and says, we'll do this, just give us a little bit of a push. So this is the kind of thing that we can do. And I don't want Sri Lankans to think that this is some impossible task, that it's an impossible dream. It's not an impossible dream. It just needs focus, right? So if we, for example, this government, one of the first things this government did was remove the concessionary tax rates for exporters, right? So what are you saying then? You're basically disincentivizing exporters in a situation where you're supposed to be addressing your trade deficit. So this is what happens when you're only focused on fiscal consolidation. You're only focused on generating tax revenue, but you've completely forgotten that in a few years, when we get our debt in order, we're still going to have to attract investment in FDI. We're still going to have to grow our exports. We should have been doing that since last year. We should have been starting incentivizing these things last year. Now we're in a brand new year, and you and I are talking about this, and I have a bad feeling you might invite me on in a couple of months, and I may have the exact same talking points, and I apologize to the audience, but the fact is that nothing has moved on. We're still in roughly the same place we were when we collapsed, except that we now have access to international markets to some degree, and we've gotten a couple of tranches from the IMF.
And we feel like everything is a bed of roses now.
Well, at least some people in Colombo seem to think that. Yeah, some people in Colombo, and I think some of the business individuals, they see stability. Stability is important. I don't want to demean this project of stability. I think we've come a long way from petrol queues and gas
shortages.
But that shouldn't be
far from
benchmark.
The ideal
that's a very
benchmark.
low bar. So.
So that's the way it was with Kusum Vijay-Tilaka, Associate Member, SJP Working Committee. Thank you very much, Kusum, for joining me and
having me.
Debating on a range of topics from the drug menace to economic policies and so on. And Kusum's message is the Sri Lanka that we all envisage, the updated pragmatic Sri Lanka, is not a dream. All we require is focus. So that is something that our viewers can ponder on tonight. Thank you very much for joining Face to Face tonight. Take care and good night.